April 20th, 2002. A hotel maid at the Red Roof Inn in Copley, Ohio discovered something that would haunt detectives for over 2 decades. A 28-year-old man slumped dead in his van, shot 3 times in what appeared to be a cold-blooded execution. For 22 years, Stephen Lindsay's killer walked free, while his family demanded answers that seemed impossible to find. But what happens when a dying man's final confession reveals a truth so shocking that even seasoned detectives can barely believe it? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Black screen sound of rain pattering against windows. Police radio chatter fades. April 20th, 2002. 8:47 p.m., the kind of spring evening in Copley, Ohio, where most people are settling in for the night, maybe catching the late news or finishing up dinner dishes. But at the Red Roof Inn on Rothrock Road, something was terribly wrong. The call came in as a welfare check. A concerned hotel employee had noticed a white Chevrolet van sitting in the parking lot for hours, its driver motionless behind the wheel. What they discovered would launch one of Summit County's most puzzling cold cases, a mystery that would remain unsolved for over 2 decades. You know, in 23 years of police work, you see a lot of things. But the Stephen Lindsay case, that one stayed with me. It was the kind of case that makes you question everything you think you know about investigation work. Detective Mike Giovanno wasn't originally assigned to what would become known as the Red Roof Inn murder. On that rainy April evening, he was wrapping up paperwork on an unrelated burglary case when the call came through dispatch. A possible overdose or medical emergency at the motel, nothing that seemed particularly unusual for a Saturday night in a blue-collar Ohio town. The first responding officers arrived at 9:03 p.m. Officer Jennifer Martinez later described the scene as eerily quiet. The van sat under one of the motel's dim security lights, its engine cold, windows slightly fogged with condensation. Inside, slumped over the steering wheel, was a young man who appeared to be sleeping. The first thing that struck me when I got there was how normal everything looked. You know, just a guy in a van. Could have been anyone taking a nap, but something felt off. The positioning wasn't right. The way his body was angled. Stephen Michael Lindsay was 28 years old. Born and raised in nearby Akron, he'd moved to the Copley area just 6 months earlier, working various odd jobs while trying to get his life back on track after a difficult divorce. Friends described him as quiet, hard-working, someone who kept to himself but was always willing to help a neighbor in need. Lindsay lived alone in a 1-bedroom apartment on Copley Circle, about 3 miles from where his body was discovered. His neighbors knew him as the guy who always waved hello, but never lingered for long conversations. He drove the same white Chevrolet van he'd been found dead in, a 1998 model he'd purchased, used just 2 months earlier to help with his handyman work. Stephen seemed like he was trying to start over. You know, he'd mentioned having some troubles in the past, but he was working hard. I always saw him leaving early in the morning, coming back after dark. Kept to himself, but in a respectful way. Never caused any problems. When paramedics attempted to rouse Lindsay, they immediately noticed something was wrong. There was no pulse, and rigor mortis had already begun to set in. But it was what they found when they moved his body that transformed a suspected medical emergency into a homicide investigation. The moment we moved him, we saw the blood. It wasn't immediately visible because of how he was positioned, but there was significant bleeding from what appeared to be gunshot wounds. That's when we knew we weren't dealing with an overdose or a heart attack. The crime scene was immediately secured. Summit County's forensics team arrived within the hour, beginning what would become an exhaustive examination of both the vehicle and its surroundings. What they discovered painted a picture of calculated violence that seemed completely at odds with the victim's quiet lifestyle. Stephen Lindsay had been shot 3 times, once in the head, once in the chest, and once in the abdomen. The medical examiner would later determine that any one of these wounds could have been fatal. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a moment of panic. This was execution-style murder. The wound pattern suggested the shooter was likely standing very close to the vehicle, possibly at the driver's side window. The trajectory of the bullets indicated the victim was sitting upright when shot, probably looking directly at his killer. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of a struggle. It appeared he knew his attacker, but perhaps most puzzling was what wasn't found at the scene. Lindsay's wallet was still in his back pocket, containing $43 in cash and all his identification. His watch, a modest but decent Timex, remained on his wrist. The van's radio and other removable items were untouched. If this was a robbery, the perpetrator had taken nothing of obvious value. That's what made this case so frustrating from day one. Usually with a shooting like this, you've got clear motives. Money, drugs, domestic issues, gang activity. But Stephen didn't fit any of those profiles. He wasn't involved with drugs, didn't have any known enemies, wasn't mixed up with the wrong crowd. He was just a regular guy trying to make it. Investigators immediately began piecing together Lindsay's final days. Security footage from a nearby gas station showed him purchasing coffee and cigarettes at 4:30 p.m. on April 20th, less than 5 hours before his body was discovered. He appeared relaxed, even chatting briefly with the cashier about the weather. Nothing suggested a man who felt he was in danger. Interview setup. Gas station cashier from 2002, now middle-aged. I remember him because he was always polite. That day was no different. He bought his usual black coffee pack of Marlboros, made some joke about the rain messing up his work schedule. Seemed perfectly normal. If someone had told me he'd be dead in a few hours, I'd have thought they were crazy. Phone records revealed that Lindsay had made 3 calls on the day of his death. One to his ex-wife in Cleveland. A brief, seemingly cordial conversation about their shared custody arrangement for their 6-year-old daughter. One to a potential client about a kitchen renovation job. And one at 6:15 p.m. to a number that would become central to the investigation. A prepaid cell phone that had been purchased with cash just 2 weeks earlier. That last call was only 37 seconds long. We traced the phone, but it had been purchased at a big box store with cash. No surveillance footage that helped us, no credit card trail. Whoever bought it didn't want to be identified. That told us this wasn't random. The location where Lindsay was killed also puzzled investigators. The Red Roof Inn wasn't somewhere he was known to frequent. He lived 3 miles away, had no connections to the motel, and wasn't registered as a guest. So what had brought him there on a rainy Saturday evening? Motel records showed that room 127, the room closest to where the van was parked, had been rented that afternoon by someone using the name Mike Johnson, paying cash for a single night. But when investigators knocked on the door at 11 p.m., they found the room empty. The bed hadn't been slept in, but there were signs someone had been there. The bathroom showed evidence of recent use, and housekeeping later found a coffee cup that had been washed and left in the sink. Mike Johnson had given a fake address and showed what appeared to be fake identification. The motel clerk remembered him as average height, average build, wearing a baseball cap pulled low. Could have been anyone. But the timing was too perfect to be coincidence. He checked in at 2 p.m. Stephen was murdered around 8 p.m. in the parking spot directly outside that room, and by 11 p.m. our Mike Johnson had vanished. The investigation's early days were marked by intensive canvassing of the area. Detectives interviewed every motel guest, every employee, every business owner within a half-mile radius. They collected hours of security footage from nearby establishments, ran background checks on everyone in Lindsay's phone contacts, and followed up on every tip that came through the department's hotline. We worked that case around the clock for the first 2 weeks. I mean, literally around the clock. We had teams going through Stephen's apartment, his van, interviewing his co-workers, his ex-wife, anybody who knew him. We were sure we'd crack it quickly. Young guy killed execution style at a motel. It seemed like the kind of case that would have obvious leads, but those obvious leads never materialized. Lindsay's ex-wife had a solid alibi. She was at work at a Cleveland hospital with dozens of witnesses. His co-workers described him as reliable and well-liked, with no workplace conflicts. His family, while heartbroken, couldn't think of anyone who would want to hurt him. The man seemed to have lived a life remarkably free of the kinds of complications that usually lead to murder. After about a month, we started looking at more exotic possibilities. Maybe it was a case of mistaken identity. Maybe Stephen was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Maybe someone thought he was someone else. But even those theories didn't hold up under scrutiny. His van was distinctive. He'd been specifically called to that location by someone who knew his phone number. The search of Lindsay's apartment yielded few clues, but painted a picture of a man trying to rebuild his life. His finances were tight but manageable. His divorce had been contentious, but was officially finalized without any threats or restraining orders. A small notebook found on his kitchen table contained job leads, appointment times, and grocery lists, the mundane details of someone focused on moving forward, not looking over his shoulder. Among his possessions, investigators found something that would haunt them for years. A letter Lindsay had started writing to his daughter, but never finished. Dated April 18th, just 2 days before his death, it began. "Dear Sarah, Daddy's working really hard to make a good life for us. I know things have been difficult, but I promise they're going to get better. I'm learning that sometimes you have to be patient and trust that good things come to people who do the right thing." That letter, man, that was hard to read. Here's a guy who's clearly trying to do right by his kid, working honest jobs, staying out of trouble. And someone executed him in a motel parking lot. For what? We couldn't figure out what he'd done to deserve that. As spring turned to summer in 2002, the Stephen Lindsay investigation began to lose momentum. The initial flood of tips had slowed to a trickle, and most leads had been thoroughly investigated and eliminated. The mysterious Mike Johnson remained unidentified despite extensive efforts. The prepaid phone that had called Lindsay was never used again after his death. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Stephen Lindsay was buried on a grey morning in late April, with his 6-year-old daughter Sarah placing a small bouquet of dandelions on his casket. The funeral was attended by about 50 people, family, co-workers, neighbors, who barely knew him but felt compelled to pay their respects to a life cut inexplicably short. I went to the funeral. I don't always do that, but something about this case. I felt like I owed it to him, and I made a promise that day, standing there watching his little girl say goodbye to her daddy. I promised I wouldn't give up on finding his killer. By the end of 2002, the Stephen Lindsay murder had officially become a cold case. The active investigation was suspended, though Detective Giovanno continued to review the file periodically, hoping something new would emerge. The case was reassigned twice over the following years as detectives retired or transferred, but no significant progress was made. The Red Roof Inn, where Lindsay died, eventually closed and was demolished in 2008. The site now houses a small strip mall with a dollar store, a nail salon, and a sandwich shop. Most residents of the area have no idea that a man was murdered there, that his death remained one of Summit County's most frustrating unsolved cases. You know, over the years, I probably reviewed this case 100 times. I'd pull out the file on slow days, or when something reminded me of it. I kept thinking I'd missed something, that there was some detail we'd overlooked. But the truth is, we'd done everything right. We'd followed every lead, interviewed every possible witness, analyzed every piece of evidence. We just didn't have enough to go on. As the years passed, Stephen Lindsay's name appeared less and less frequently in local newspapers. His case was occasionally featured in cold case segments on local television, generating a handful of tips that led nowhere. His daughter, Sarah, grew up with only scattered memories of her father. Raised by her mother and stepfather in Cleveland, by 2020, The Stephen Lindsay murder was nearly forgotten by everyone except the investigators who had worked it and the family members who still grieved him. The case file, now 18 years old, contained hundreds of pages of reports, interviews, and evidence documentation. But it also contained something that would prove crucial 2 decades later, detailed notes about evidence that only the killer would know. We always held back certain details from the public. It's standard procedure in homicide investigations. There were specific things about the crime scene, about how Stephen was killed, that only the perpetrator would know. We called them hold-back details. At the time, we thought we might need them to verify a confession or eliminate false confessions. I never imagined we'd actually use them 20-plus years later, November 15, 2024. Detective Jovano's phone rang at 2:30 in the afternoon. The caller identified himself as Robert Anderson, and he said he had information about the Stephen Lindsay murder. Information that would finally explain what happened in that motel parking lot on a rainy evening in 2002. What Robert Anderson was about to tell Detective Jovano would not only solve one of Summit County's oldest cold cases, but reveal a truth so unexpected that even seasoned investigators would struggle to believe it. A truth that began with a dying man's confession and ended with justice delayed by more than 2 decades. Detective, my name is Robert Anderson. I have information about the Stephen Lindsay murder from 2002. Information I should have given you a long time ago. In 23 years of police work, you get a lot of calls from people claiming to know something about old cases. Most of them are well-meaning, but ultimately unhelpful. Some are from people with mental health issues. A few are from attention seekers. But there was something different about Robert Anderson's voice, something that made me sit up and pay attention. The call that would finally crack the Stephen Lindsay case came 22 years, 6 months, and 26 days after the murder. Detective Mike Jovano had been working cold cases for the Summit County Sheriff's Department for the past 5 years, a role that often felt more like archaeology than police work, digging through the past, hoping to unearth something that previous investigators had missed. Cold case work is different from active investigations. You're dealing with memories that have faded, witnesses who have moved away or died, evidence that's been sitting in storage for decades. Technology changes, investigative techniques evolve. But the basic challenge remains the same. You're trying to solve a puzzle with pieces that have been scattered by time. Robert Anderson's call came on a Tuesday afternoon. He'd been calling the department's main line every few days for 2 weeks, always hanging up before being transferred to a detective. The desk sergeant had started to recognize his voice. When he finally stayed on the line long enough to be connected to Detective Jovano, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the phone. I knew I had to call eventually. I'd been carrying this secret for over a year, and it was eating me alive. But I also knew that once I made that call, everything would change. Not just for the investigation, but for my family, for my brother's memory. I wasn't sure I was ready for that. Robert told me he had information about his brother, Neil Anderson. He said Neil had confessed to killing Stephen Lindsay before he died in March of 2023. I immediately pulled up our database to see if we had any record of Neil Anderson in connection with the case. We didn't. The name had never come up in our investigation. Neil Anderson was 41 years old when he died of pancreatic cancer in March 2023. Born in 1982, he would have been just 20 at the time of Stephen Lindsay's murder. He'd lived most of his adult life in the Akron area, working various construction and manual labor jobs. On paper, his life appeared unremarkable. No significant criminal record, no obvious connections to Stephen Lindsay, no reason he should have appeared on investigators' radar in 2002. But sometimes the most important connections are the ones that exist in the shadows, away from official records and public scrutiny. As Detective Jovano would soon discover, Neil Anderson and Stephen Lindsay's paths had crossed in ways that wouldn't have been apparent to investigators. 22 years earlier, the First thing I did after Robert's call was to verify that Neil Anderson had actually existed and died when Robert claimed. Death records confirmed it. Pancreatic cancer. Died at university hospitals in Cleveland on March 14, 2023. Then I started looking into his background, trying to figure out how he might have known Stephen Lindsay. Neil Anderson's final weeks were spent in the oncology ward at university hospitals, a sprawling medical complex in Cleveland. According to hospital records, he was admitted on February 28, 2023, as his condition rapidly deteriorated. His only regular visitors were his brother Robert and Robert's wife Jennifer. The nursing staff remembered Neil as a quiet patient who seemed to be struggling with something beyond his physical pain. I visited with Neil several times during his stay. He wasn't particularly religious, but he seemed to have something weighing heavily on his mind. He talked about wanting to set things right before he died. I assumed he was referring to estranged family relationships or old grudges, the kind of emotional baggage people often want to resolve at the end of their lives. I had no idea he was carrying the secret of a murder. According to Robert Anderson, Neil's confession came during what would be their last meaningful conversation. It was March 10, 2023, 4 days before Neil's death. Robert had been sitting beside his brother's hospital bed, both men knowing that time was running out. They'd been talking about childhood memories, trying to find some comfort in happier times. Neil had been in and out of consciousness for days. The medications made him confused sometimes, but on that Friday afternoon, he was completely lucid. We were talking about when we were kids, about our parents, about mistakes we'd both made. And then, out of nowhere, he said, "Bobby, I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you a long time ago." What Neil Anderson confessed to his brother that day would explain not only who killed Stephen Lindsay, but why, revealing a motive that investigators in 2002 could never have uncovered, because the key players had worked so hard to keep their connection secret. He told me he'd killed a man in 2002. He said the man's name was Stephen Lindsay, and he'd shot him outside a motel in Copley. He said he'd been carrying the guilt for 21 years, and he couldn't die without telling someone the truth. When Robert told me about the confession, my first instinct was skepticism. You'd be amazed how many people confess to crimes they didn't commit, especially when they're dying or grieving. But then Robert started providing details about the murder that we'd never released to the public. Details that only the killer would know. Those hold-back details, the investigative secrets that Detective Urbano and his colleagues had carefully protected for over 2 decades, suddenly became the key to verifying Neil Anderson's confession. According to Robert, his brother had described the crime scene with stunning accuracy, including details about Stephen Lindsay's position in the van, the sequence of gunshots, and specific evidence that had never been disclosed to the media. Neil knew that Stephen had been shot 3 times, head, chest, abdomen. But more than that, he knew the order of the shots. He knew that Stephen had been sitting upright, facing the driver's side window. He knew about the coffee cup Stephen had been holding. None of that information was ever public. The only way Neil could have known those details was if he'd been there, if he'd been the one pulling the trigger, but knowledge of the crime scene details was only part of what made Neil Anderson's confession credible. According to Robert, his brother had also explained the motive, a reason for murder that investigators in 2002 had never considered because they hadn't known to look for it. Neil told me that Stephen Lindsay owed him money, not a small amount, several $1,000s. He said Stephen had borrowed the money for some kind of business venture that went bad. And when Neil tried to collect, Stephen kept making excuses, kept promising to pay, but never did. That motive explained a lot of things that had puzzled us for years. Why Stephen had driven to that specific motel, why he'd received that call from the prepaid phone, why the killer hadn't taken anything from the scene. This wasn't a robbery or a random crime. It was a debt collection that went fatally wrong. To verify Robert Anderson's account, Detective Urbano began investigating the connection between Neil Anderson and Stephen Lindsay. What he discovered was a relationship that had deliberately been kept off the books, a lending arrangement that existed entirely in cash transactions and verbal agreements, the kind of financial relationship that leaves no paper trail. Stephen had mentioned borrowing money from someone to start a small contracting business. This would have been in late 2001, early 2002. He was excited about the opportunity and said he'd found someone willing to lend him startup capital without all the bank paperwork and credit checks. He never mentioned the lender's name, but he said it was someone who understood the construction business. Neil Anderson had indeed worked in construction throughout his 20s, primarily as a framing carpenter and general laborer. He'd also developed a reputation among his co-workers as someone who always seemed to have cash on hand, money he'd earned from side jobs, overtime work and careful saving. For someone like Stephen Lindsay, who was struggling financially after his divorce, Neil would have seemed like an ideal private lender. We found evidence that Stephen had tried to start a handyman business in early 2002. He'd purchased some tools, printed business cards, even put a small ad in the local paper. But the business never really got off the ground. By April 2002, he was back to working odd jobs for other contractors. If he'd borrowed money to fund that venture, he would have been under pressure to repay it, according to Neil Anderson's confession. As relayed by his brother, the meeting at the Red Roof Inn was supposed to be a final negotiation. Neil had registered under the false name Mike Johnson and called Stephen from the prepaid phone, asking him to come to the motel to discuss a payment plan. But what was meant to be a conversation quickly escalated into violence. Neil said that Stephen showed up with only a few $100, maybe $300 or $400, but he owed several thousand. Neil felt like Stephen was trying to string him along, make partial payments forever without ever settling the debt. They argued and Stephen started to drive away. Neil said he just snapped. He pulled out a gun and started shooting. The positioning made sense with Neil's confession. If Stephen was trying to drive away and Neil was standing beside the van, that would explain the angle of the gunshots, the way Stephen's body was found slumped over the steering wheel. It wasn't a calm, calculated execution. It was rage, frustration, a moment where someone lost control completely. But Neil Anderson's confession raised new questions, even as it answered old ones. Most significantly, why had he waited 21 years to tell anyone what he'd done? And why, even on his deathbed, had he chosen to confess only to his brother rather than to police or clergy? I asked him that. I asked why he'd never turned himself in, why he'd let Stephen's family suffer all these years without answers. He said he'd thought about it every day since it happened. But he was young when it happened, only 20 years old, and he was scared. As the years went by, it became harder and harder to come forward. He'd built a life, had relationships, and a job. He couldn't figure out how to admit what he'd done without destroying everything else. That's probably the most human part of this whole story. Neil Anderson wasn't a career criminal or a sociopath. He was a young man who made a terrible decision in a moment of anger, and then spent the rest of his life living with the consequences. The guilt ate at him for decades, but he was too afraid or too ashamed to do the right thing. With Neil Anderson's confession providing both motive and method, Detective Jovano began the process of formally closing the Stephen Lindsay case. But first, he needed to verify as many details as possible and ensure that Robert Anderson's account was accurate and complete. I spent the next several weeks investigating every aspect of Robert's story. I verified Neil's employment history, looked for any previous connections between Neil and Stephen, checked hospital records to confirm the timeline of the confession. Everything checked out. This wasn't someone seeking attention or trying to protect the real killer. This was a man carrying his brother's final secret. The investigation also revealed why Neil Anderson had never appeared on investigators' radar in 2002. He'd lived in a different county, worked for cash-based employers who kept minimal records, and had no direct social connections to Stephen Lindsay beyond their private financial arrangement. In an era before social media and digital transaction records, such a connection could easily remain invisible to law enforcement. If this case had happened today, we probably would have solved it much faster. Digital banking records, cell phone GPS data, social media connections, all of that would have made it easier to trace the relationship between Neil and Stephen. But in 2002, with a cash transaction and a prepaid phone, they were able to keep their business completely off the radar. For Robert Anderson, the decision to finally contact police came after months of internal struggle. His brother had died carrying the secret of murder, but he'd also shared that secret with Robert. The moral burden of that knowledge, knowing that Stephen Lindsay's family still had no answers while he possessed the truth, became unbearable. I kept thinking about Stephen's daughter. Neil told me he had a little girl and said he felt terrible about taking her father away. I have kids too, and I couldn't imagine not knowing what happened to their father. I realized that keeping Neil's secret wasn't protecting him anymore. He was gone, but it was still hurting Stephen's family, and that wasn't right. Robert's decision to come forward took tremendous courage. He knew that revealing his brother's confession would bring shame to his family, that people would wonder if he'd known all along, that Neil's memory would be forever associated with murder. But he did it anyway because he knew it was the right thing to do. By December 2024, Detective Giovanni had compiled enough evidence to officially recommend that the Stephen Lindsay case be closed, with Neil Anderson identified as the perpetrator. The confession, combined with Anderson's detailed knowledge of the crime scene and the newly understood motive, provided what prosecutors called moral certainty about his guilt. When Detective Giovanni asked me to review the case with this new information, everything suddenly made perfect sense. The wound patterns, the crime scene positioning, the apparent personal nature of the attack, it all aligned with someone who knew the victim and felt betrayed by him. This wasn't random violence. It was a relationship that went tragically wrong. After 22 years, we finally had answers. Not the kind of answers that lead to an arrest and trial. Neil Anderson was beyond the reach of earthly justice. But we had the truth, and sometimes that's the best you can hope for in cold case work. The truth and the peace of mind that comes with finally understanding what happened. The official closure of the Stephen Lindsay case brought a mixture of relief and grief to those who had been touched by the investigation. For Detective Giovanni, it represented the fulfillment of a promise made at a young father's funeral more than 2 decades earlier. For Robert Anderson, it meant the end of a burden he'd carried in silence for nearly 2 years. But the most profound impact of Neil Anderson's posthumous confession would be felt by those who had loved Stephen Lindsay and spent 22 years wondering why he died. The truth, when it finally came, would bring both closure and new questions about justice, forgiveness, and the weight of secrets carried too long. I was 28 years old when Detective Giovanni called me, the same age my father was when he died. I'd spent my entire adult life wondering if his killer was still out there, if I might unknowingly pass him on the street, if he was living a normal life while my father was in the ground. Getting that phone call, it changed everything. December 3rd, 2024, Detective Mike Giovanni sat in his car outside a small ranch home in Cleveland's Tremont neighborhood, preparing for one of the most difficult conversations of his career. Inside that house lived Sarah Lindsay Martinez, the 6-year-old girl who had placed dandelions on her father's casket 22 years earlier. Now a mother of 2 with questions that had haunted her for more than half her life. Making that call to Sarah was probably the hardest part of closing this case. How do you tell someone that their father's killer has been dead for almost 2 years? How do you explain that justice came in the form of a deathbed confession that no one heard except the killer's brother? There's no training that prepares you for those conversations. Sarah had been living with unanswered questions since she was old enough to understand what had happened to her father. Raised primarily by her mother and stepfather, she'd grown up knowing that Stephen Lindsay had been murdered, but never knowing why. The uncertainty had shaped her entire worldview. creating a deep-seated anxiety about the randomness of violence and the fragility of safety. As a child, I used to have nightmares that whoever killed my dad would come for me, too. I didn't understand why anyone would want to hurt him. He was just my dad, you know. He fixed things and told silly jokes and always smelled like coffee and aftershave. The not knowing made it worse because my imagination filled in the blanks with all kinds of terrible possibilities. Detective Jovano met with Sarah and her mother, Linda, at a quiet coffee shop near Sarah's home. He'd brought a thick folder containing 22 years of investigation files, crime scene photos, and interview transcripts. But most importantly, he carried the truth about what had happened on that rainy April evening in 2002. I started by explaining that we'd identified the killer, but that he died the previous year. I could see the confusion and disappointment in Sarah's eyes. She'd waited so long for justice, and now she was being told that justice, at least in the traditional sense, was impossible. My first thought was anger. Pure anger. This person had taken Stephen's life, destroyed our family's peace of mind, and then got to live for 20 more years while we suffered. The fact that he died of cancer almost felt like he'd escaped accountability. It wasn't the justice I'd been hoping for. Detective Jovano carefully explained Neil Anderson's confession, the financial motive, and the circumstances that had led to Stephen's death. For the first time in over 2 decades, the Lindsay family had a clear picture of what had happened to their loved one. But knowledge, they discovered, brought its own complications. Learning that it was about money, that my father died over a debt, was almost harder to accept than not knowing. At least when it was a mystery, I could imagine that maybe he died trying to help someone, or that it was some kind of accident. Finding out he was killed because someone was angry about money made it feel so pointless. I showed them some of the evidence we'd collected over the years. Stephen's personal effects, photos of the crime scene, witness statements. I wanted them to understand how thoroughly we'd investigated, how many people had worked on their case over the years. Sometimes families think the police just gave up, but that wasn't true here. We never stopped caring about Stephen Lindsay. The meeting at the coffee shop lasted nearly 3 hours. Detective Jovano answered every question Sarah and her mother could think of, explaining not just what had happened, but why the case had remained unsolved for so long. He described the challenges of investigating a crime with no apparent motive, no witnesses, and a killer who had successfully hidden his connection to the victim. I asked Detective Jovano if Stephen had suffered, if he'd been afraid. He was very gentle in explaining that the attack happened quickly, that Stephen probably didn't have time to be scared. That brought me some comfort. For 22 years, I'd worried that Stephen's final moments were filled with terror. After the meeting with Detective Jovano, Sarah faced the challenge of processing information she'd waited most of her life to receive. The answers she desperately wanted brought a mixture of relief and renewed grief. Knowing the truth meant confronting the reality of her father's death in ways she'd never had to before. I went home that day and looked at all the pictures of my dad that I keep around the house. For the first time, I wasn't wondering what had happened to him, but that opened up a whole new set of emotions. Now I was angry, not just sad, but genuinely angry. Someone had decided that money was more important than my father's life, more important than my childhood, more important than my kids ever meeting their grandfather. When families receive answers about cold cases after many years, the emotional response is often more complex than they expect. There's relief, certainly, but also renewed grief as they process the details of their loved one's final moments. Sometimes there's guilt about moving on with their lives while the case remains unsolved. Meanwhile, news of the case's resolution was spreading through the communities where both Stephen Lindsay and Neil Anderson had lived and worked. For Neil's former co-workers and acquaintances, the revelation that he'd been a killer came as a complete shock. The man they'd known bore no resemblance to someone capable of murder. Neil was always quiet, but he seemed like a decent guy. He showed up for work on time, did his job, and didn't cause trouble. If someone had told me he'd killed a man, I would have laughed at them. It just goes to show you never really know what's going on inside someone's head. He'd come in maybe once or twice a week, always by himself. Never caused any problems, never got too drunk, always paid his tab. He was polite but distant, like he was carrying something heavy. Now I wonder if that something was guilt about what he'd done. Word of the Stephen Lindsay case resolution began attracting media attention as news outlets learned about the unusual circumstances of its closure. A 22-year-old murder solved by a deathbed confession was exactly the kind of story that captured public imagination. But Detective Giovanni was careful about how much information to release, mindful of protecting both families involved. We had to balance the public's right to know with the privacy concerns of two families. Stephen's family deserved to have their story told if they wanted it told. But Neil Anderson's family was also dealing with a tremendous shock, learning that their brother and son had been a killer. They didn't ask for this attention. Robert Anderson found himself in an impossible position. His decision to reveal his brother's confession had solved a decades-old mystery and brought closure to the Lindsay family. But it had also destroyed his own family's perception of Neil and subjected them to scrutiny they never wanted. My wife asked me if I regretted coming forward. It's a fair question. Our kids are going to grow up knowing their uncle was a murderer. Neil's friends and co-workers all think they never really knew him. Our family name is going to be associated with this crime forever. But Stephen Lindsay's daughter deserved to know the truth. I couldn't live with keeping that from her. On December 15, 2024, Sarah Lindsay Martinez visited her father's grave for the first time since learning the identity of his killer. She brought a letter she'd written but never intended to send. A letter addressed to Neil Anderson, the man who had taken her father's life and then lived with that secret for over 2 decades. I wrote that letter because I had things I needed to say, even though he was dead and would never hear them. I told him about my wedding day, about becoming a mother, about all the moments when I missed my dad terribly. I told him that I forgave him not because he deserved it, but because carrying hatred was too heavy for me. Forgiveness is often misunderstood as being about the person who wronged you. But forgiveness is really about freeing yourself from the burden of anger and resentment. Sarah understood that her father would want her to find peace, not to spend her life consumed by hatred for someone who was already beyond human justice. In January 2025, the Summit County Prosecutor's Office held a press conference to officially announce the closure of the Stephen Lindsay case. Prosecutor Elena Rodriguez explained that while Neil Anderson could not be prosecuted due to his death, the evidence was sufficient to conclude that he was responsible for the murder. While we cannot achieve traditional justice through the court system, we can provide the victim's family with answers they have sought for more than 2 decades. The investigation conducted by our office and the Summit County Sheriff's Department conclusively identifies Neil Anderson as the person responsible for Stephen Lindsay's death. This unusual case highlights the challenges faced by law enforcement in investigating crimes where the perpetrator successfully conceals their connection to the victim. It also demonstrates the importance of coming forward with information, even years after a crime has been committed. For Sarah Lindsay Martinez, the resolution of her father's case marked the end of one chapter of grief and the beginning of another phase of healing. She began speaking publicly about the impact of unsolved cases on families, advocating for continued funding of cold case investigations. My children ask me about their grandfather now, and for the first time I can tell them the whole story. Not just that he was killed, but why and by whom. It's still a sad story, but it's complete. There's something powerful about having a complete story, even when the ending isn't happy. Solving Stephen's case reminded me why I do this work. Every file in that storage room represents a family that needs answers, a life that was cut short, a truth that's waiting to be discovered. Sometimes the answers come quickly, sometimes they take decades. And sometimes they come from places you never expected. Cold cases have a unique impact on families because the grief never gets to complete its natural cycle. Without answers, families can't fully process what happened or begin to heal. When cases like Stephen Lindsay's get solved after many years, it often reopens old wounds, but it also allows for genuine closure. The site where Stephen Lindsay died has been transformed multiple times over the past 2 decades. The Red Roof Inn was demolished in 2008, replaced by a strip mall that now houses a dollar store, a nail salon, and a sandwich shop. Most customers have no idea that the parking lot where they parked their cars was once a crime scene that puzzled investigators for over 20 years. I've started meeting with other families who have lost loved ones to unsolved crimes. There's something powerful about talking to people who understand what it's like to live with questions that have no answers. We support each other, share resources, and advocate for the investigators who are still working on our cases. The Stephen Lindsay case taught me that you never know where the break in a cold case is going to come from. It might be new technology, a witness who finally decides to come forward, or a deathbed confession relayed by a family member. The key is to never give up, to keep the files active, to always be ready when that break comes. Local newspapers in Summit County covered the resolution of the Stephen Lindsay case extensively, with many readers expressing surprise that such a long-standing mystery had finally been solved. The story resonated particularly strongly with families who had lost loved ones to unsolved crimes, reminding them that justice, while sometimes delayed, was still possible in a twist of fate that no one involved could have predicted. Stephen Lindsay and Neil Anderson are buried in cemeteries less than 5 miles apart. Stephen lies beneath a granite headstone that reads, "Beloved Father," while Neil rests under a simple marker bearing only his name and dates. Their final proximity seems to underscore the tragic randomness of their intersection in life. My kids know about their grandfather now, not just that he existed, but who he was and how he died. I tell them that bad things sometimes happen to good people, but that doesn't mean we should live in fear. I tell them that their grandfather would want them to be kind, to work hard, and to always tell the truth, even when it's difficult. The resolution of the Stephen Lindsay case brought closure to a family that had waited over 2 decades for answers. But it also raised new questions about justice, redemption, and the weight of secrets carried too long. Neil Anderson had lived 21 years with the knowledge of what he'd done, dying before he could face earthly consequences for his actions. As the investigation officially closed, those touched by the case were left to grapple with complex questions about guilt, forgiveness, and the nature of justice itself. The truth had finally emerged, but the moral implications of that truth would continue to resonate long after the case files were sealed. When a perpetrator dies before prosecution, we're faced with fundamental questions about the nature of justice itself. Is justice purely punitive, or can it be achieved through truth and acknowledgement alone? The Stephen Lindsay case forces us to examine these philosophical boundaries. But what about deterrence? If someone knows they can escape consequences by simply outliving the investigation, doesn't that undermine the entire system? February 2025, 3 months after the official closure of the Stephen Lindsay murder case. The story had evolved from a local news item into a national conversation about justice, redemption, and the moral complexities of posthumous confessions. Law schools, ethics programs, and victim advocacy groups were using the case as a framework for examining difficult questions that had no easy answers. The Copley case presents what we call a moral paradox of delayed justice. The victim's family receives the closure they desperately needed, but society is denied the cathartic ritual of punishment. We're forced to ask, who is justice really for? I'm here with criminologist Dr. Rebecca Walsh, discussing a case that's challenging our understanding of justice and closure. Dr. Walsh, what makes the Stephen Lindsay case so unique in the landscape of cold case resolutions? What's fascinating about this case is how it strips away all the procedural elements we associate with justice: arrest, trial, sentencing, and forces us to confront the essential question: is truth enough? For 22 years, the Lindsay family lived with uncertainty. Now they have certainty, but the perpetrator is beyond accountability. The philosophical implications of the case were more than academic exercises for families dealing with similar losses. Support groups across Ohio found themselves grappling with whether the Lindsay family's experience represented true closure or simply a different kind of frustration. When Sarah first shared her story with our group, the reactions were incredibly mixed. Some families felt inspired that answers were still possible after decades. Others felt frustrated that the person responsible had essentially gotten away with it by dying before facing consequences. My husband was killed 8 years ago, and we still don't know who did it. Part of me envies Sarah for having answers, but part of me thinks I'd be even angrier if I found out the killer had been living a normal life all this time and then just died peacefully in a hospital bed. But at least she knows. At least her children know what happened to their grandfather. That has to count for something, doesn't it? The truth has value even when justice can't follow. For Summit County Prosecutor Elena Rodriguez, the Lindsay case represented both a victory and a frustration. Her office had successfully identified a killer and provided answers to a grieving family, but they'd been denied the opportunity to seek justice through the courts. As prosecutors, we're trained to think in terms of convictions and sentences. Success is measured by our ability to hold criminals accountable through the legal system. The Lindsay case forced me to reconsider whether our definition of success might be too narrow. Sometimes, truth itself is a form of justice. If Neil Anderson had lived to face trial, his defense would have been challenging but not impossible. 22 years had passed, evidence had degraded, witnesses' memories had faded. A confession to a dying man's brother, while compelling, would face serious evidentiary challenges in court. There's a possibility he might have been acquitted despite being guilty. Neil Anderson's case illustrates a common pattern among perpetrators of impulsive violent crimes. The initial act is often a moment of rage or desperation, but the aftermath creates a different kind of psychological burden. Many killers experience what we call moral injury, a deep wound to their sense of self that can persist for decades. To better understand Neil Anderson's psychological state in the years following the murder, investigators and psychologists began examining his life patterns, looking for signs of the guilt and trauma that Robert Anderson said had plagued his brother for over 2 decades. Looking back, there were signs that Neil was carrying something heavy. He was always reliable, always punctual, but he seemed careful, like he was trying really hard to be a good person, you know. He'd volunteer for extra shifts, help co-workers with personal problems. Always the first to offer assistance when someone was struggling. Neil would come to services maybe once a month, always sat in the back, always left immediately after. He'd put money in the collection plate, more than most people, but he never stayed for fellowship or community events. When I tried to approach him after services, he seemed almost frightened of personal connection. Perpetrators of serious crimes often experience what we call perpetrator trauma, psychological distress caused by their own actions. This can manifest as hypervigilance, social isolation, compulsive good behavior designed to balance the scales, and what Neil's brother described as persistent guilt and anxiety. Robert Anderson had become an inadvertent expert on his brother's psychological state during the 21 years between the murder and Neil's death. In extended interviews with investigators and psychologists, he painted a picture of a man tormented by his actions, but unable to find a path toward redemption. Neil never dated seriously after 2002. He'd start relationships, but always found ways to sabotage them before they became serious. When I asked him about it once, he said he didn't deserve happiness, that he'd done something that made him unworthy of love. I thought he was being dramatic about some minor mistake. I had no idea he meant murder. Understanding Neil's psychological state helps explain why this case was so difficult to solve. He wasn't a career criminal who might commit other crimes that would bring him to our attention. He was someone trying desperately to live a completely law-abiding life, as if perfect behavior could somehow atone for what he'd done. The Anderson case supports research suggesting that many one-time violent offenders experience severe psychological consequences that effectively prevent them from reoffending. The guilt and trauma can be so intense that they become hyper-moral in their subsequent behavior, almost compulsively law-abiding. The Lindsay case had become a teaching tool for victim advocates, illustrating the complex emotional landscape that families navigate when long-sought answers finally arrive. The case highlighted how closure, rather than being a simple endpoint, often opens new emotional territories that families must learn to navigate. We used to think that getting answers was the finish line for families of victims. The Lindsay case taught us that getting answers is actually a new beginning. Families have to process not just what happened, but why it happened, who was responsible, and what that means for their understanding of justice and healing. David asked me if I wished Neil Anderson was still alive so he could face trial. It's something I think about a lot. Part of me wants to believe that seeing him in handcuffs, hearing a judge sentence him, would have felt like justice. But another part of me wonders if watching him as a sick, dying man would have just made me feel sorry for him. The criminal justice system provides a structured way for society to process violence and assign accountability. When that system can't function because the perpetrator has died or disappeared, families and communities are left to create their own sense of justice. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. We've received dozens of letters from readers about our coverage of the Lindsay case. Some people feel that giving so much attention to Neil Anderson's confession somehow glorifies him or gives him a platform he doesn't deserve. Others argue that understanding why crimes happen is essential for preventing future violence. The conversation around the Lindsay case had sparked broader community discussions about unsolved crimes, the resources devoted to cold case investigations, and the support available to families of victims. A public forum in Copley drew over 200 residents, many sharing their own experiences with crime and justice. My car was broken into last year, and the police basically told me there was nothing they could do. But they spent decades working on this one murder case. I understand murder is more serious, but it feels like there are different levels of justice depending on what happened to you. I think what happened with the Lindsay family gives hope to other families with unsolved cases. It shows that investigators don't give up, that answers can come even after many years. That's valuable even if the ending isn't perfect. The Lindsay case illustrates why we maintain detailed case files and preserve evidence even in seemingly hopeless situations. The breakthrough came not from new technology or forensic advances, but from human conscience. Someone decided to do the right thing, and because we'd preserved everything, we could verify their information. The philosophical question at the heart of the Lindsay case is whether justice is about punishment, truth, or healing. Different cultures and legal systems would answer that question differently. In some traditions, acknowledging wrongdoing and accepting responsibility, even posthumously, constitutes a form of justice. I'm writing my thesis on restorative justice approaches to posthumous confessions. The Lindsay case is particularly interesting because the confession came through a family member rather than directly from the perpetrator. It raises questions about inherited responsibility and the role of family in achieving justice. Investigators had obtained permission to examine Neil Anderson's former residence, hoping to find additional evidence that might corroborate his confession or provide insight into his psychological state during the years after the murder. What they discovered painted a picture of a man living in self-imposed emotional exile. Neil's apartment was almost monastic in its simplicity. Minimal furniture, no personal decorations, no photographs of friends or family. It was like he'd deliberately stripped his life of anything that might bring joy or comfort. The only books were about construction techniques and some religious texts about redemption and forgiveness. In a storage unit rented under Neil Anderson's name, investigators found boxes of journals dating back to 2003, the year after Stephen Lindsay's murder. The journals provided an unprecedented window into the mind of someone living with the secret of murder for over 2 decades. The journals reveal a pattern of rumination, guilt, and attempts at self-punishment that's consistent with severe moral injury. Neil wrote extensively about feeling like he was living a lie, about not deserving the ordinary pleasures of life. He documented every good deed he performed, as if he was keeping a ledger to balance against his crime. There are entries where Neil wrote about wanting to confess, about driving to police stations and sitting in the parking lot, but being unable to go inside. He wrote about Stephen's daughter, wondering how she was growing up, whether she remembered her father. The guilt was eating him alive. Based on the journal entries and behavioral patterns described by his family, Neil Anderson appears to have been suffering from complex PTSD related to his own actions. This is relatively rare, but not unknown among perpetrators of impulsive, violent crimes who retain normal moral functioning. Reading those journals after Neil died was almost as shocking as hearing his confession. I knew he'd been struggling with something, but I had no idea how much pain he was in. He wrote about wanting to die, about feeling like he was poison to everyone around him. If I'd known what was really wrong, maybe I could have convinced him to come forward sooner. Neil Anderson's grave receives occasional visitors, not friends or family celebrating his life, but researchers, students, and others drawn by the complex moral questions his story raises. His headstone bears only his name and dates, offering no hint of the secret he carried or the life he took. Sometimes I wonder what my father would want me to feel about Neil Anderson. Dad was a forgiving person, someone who believed people could change and deserved second chances. I think he'd want me to feel sorry for Neil, to recognize that taking someone's life destroyed Neil's life too, just in a different way. The discovery of Neil Anderson's journals added layers of complexity to an already morally ambiguous case. They revealed a man who had spent 2 decades in a prison of his own making, tormented by guilt, but unable to find a path toward redemption that wouldn't destroy the life he'd built after his crime. As the investigation moved toward its final chapter, the questions raised by the case extended far beyond the simple matter of who killed Stephen Lindsay. The case had become a mirror reflecting society's deepest assumptions about justice, redemption, and the possibility of atonement for irreversible acts. Today marks exactly 23 years since my father was taken from us. For 22 of those years, we lived with questions. This year, for the first time, we gathered answers. Not the answers we wanted, perhaps, but the truth we needed. I want to talk today, not just about my father's death, but about the ripple effects of violence, how one act of anger on a rainy April night changed countless lives in ways the perpetrator could never have imagined. April 20th, 2025, 23 years to the day after Stephen Lindsay's murder. Over 150 people gathered at the Copley Community Chapel for a memorial service that served multiple purposes. Honoring Stephen's memory, acknowledging Neil Anderson's victims' families' pain, and exploring what healing might look like when traditional justice is impossible. The memorial service was Sarah's idea, conceived during months of reflection about how to process the complex emotions surrounding her father's case. Unlike a typical memorial, this service would acknowledge the full scope of the tragedy, both the victim and the perpetrator, both the families destroyed by violence and the community grappling with difficult questions about justice and redemption. When Sarah first approached me about this memorial service, I wasn't sure how to respond. How do you honor a murder victim while also acknowledging the humanity of their killer? How do you create space for both grief and forgiveness? These aren't questions seminary school prepares you for. Among the congregation sat Robert Anderson and his family, an arrangement that had required careful negotiation and considerable courage from both families. Robert's presence represented something unprecedented. The family of a perpetrator publicly sharing space with the family of their loved one's victim, united in their commitment to truth and healing. Sarah personally invited us to attend. She said she wanted to acknowledge that Neil's crime had created victims on both sides, that my family had also been devastated by learning the truth about what he'd done. Her grace in extending that invitation was extraordinary. For years, I thought justice would mean seeing my father's killer in handcuffs, watching him be sentenced, knowing he was locked away. But I've learned that justice can take many forms. Sometimes justice is simply truth. Sometimes it's acknowledgement. Sometimes it's the courage to forgive what seems unforgivable. The memorial service included readings from Stephen Lindsay's unfinished letter to his daughter, excerpts from Neil Anderson's journals, with Robert's permission, and testimonials from community members about the impact of both the crime and its resolution. The service was designed to hold space for the full complexity of the situation. The Copley case reminds us that behind every crime statistic are human beings, not just victims, but perpetrators who must live with the consequences of their actions. Neil Anderson's 21 years of psychological torment don't excuse his crime, but they remind us that violence creates suffering that extends far beyond its immediate target. I've lived in Copley for 40 years, and I remember when Stephen's murder happened. It made all of us feel less safe, more suspicious of strangers. Learning that the killer had been carrying that guilt for so long somehow makes the world feel not safer exactly, but more understandable. Even evil actions can create their own justice. After the formal service, attendees gathered outside for informal conversations that continued for over an hour. Many community members expressed surprise at how the memorial had affected them, noting that acknowledging the perpetrator's suffering hadn't diminished their sympathy. For the victim's family, it had simply expanded their understanding of the tragedy's scope. I thought I'd be angry hearing about Neil Anderson's guilt and suffering, but listening to Sarah talk about forgiveness, seeing Robert Anderson's family there, it made me realize that healing doesn't require hatred. Maybe it requires the opposite. Following the memorial service, Sarah Lindsay Martinez and Robert Anderson met privately for the first time since their initial conversation facilitated by Detective Giovanno. Their conversation would become the foundation for an unprecedented collaboration between victim and perpetrator families. I told Robert that I didn't blame him for what his brother had done, but I thanked him for having the courage to come forward with the truth. Without his decision to break that family secret, my children would never have known what happened to their grandfather. Sarah asked me about Neil's childhood, what he was like before the murder. I told her he'd been a gentle kid, someone who cried when he accidentally stepped on bugs. She said knowing that made it easier for her to believe that killing her father had tortured him for the rest of his life. The collaboration between the Lindsay and Anderson families led to their joint involvement with victim advocacy organizations, where they began speaking about the complex dynamics of posthumous confessions and the multiple forms that justice can take. Having Sarah and Robert speak together at our training has been incredibly powerful for both victim families and for professionals working in the field. They demonstrate that healing doesn't require simplistic narratives about good and evil. It requires space for complexity and nuance. What Sarah and Robert bring to our discussions about justice is lived experience of its complexities. They've shown our students that real justice often looks very different from what we see in television dramas or legal textbooks. How do you balance seeking justice with the reality that punishment wasn't possible in your case? I've learned that punishment and justice aren't necessarily the same thing. Neil Anderson punished himself every day for 21 years. My family needed truth and acknowledgement more than we needed revenge. In May 2025, Detective Mike Giovano announced his retirement from the Summit County Sheriff's Department, citing the resolution of the Stephen Lindsay case as a fitting end to his law enforcement career. His final weeks were spent documenting lessons learned from the case for future cold case investigators. The Lindsay case taught me that sometimes the best investigative work is simply keeping the door open for truth to walk through. We didn't solve this case through brilliant detective work. We solved it because someone's conscience finally overcame their fear, and we were ready to listen when they called. Never underestimate the power of guilt and conscience in solving cold cases. Some perpetrators carry their secrets to the grave, but others, especially those who aren't career criminals, often reach a point where the psychological burden becomes unbearable. Your job is to be ready when that moment comes. In June 2025, the city of Copley dedicated a small memorial garden on the site where the Red Roof Inn once stood. The garden honors not just Stephen Lindsay, but all victims of unsolved crimes and their families. The centerpiece is a bench inscribed with the words, "Truth is the first step toward healing." This memorial recognizes that healing from violence is a community responsibility. We can't bring back those we've lost, but we can commit to supporting their families and working toward a more just society. I bring my kids here sometimes to talk about their grandfather. We sit on the bench and I tell them stories about him, not just how he died, but how he lived. They know he was kind, hard-working, and that he loved them even though he never got to meet them. The Stephen Lindsay case has become the subject of ongoing academic research into posthumous confessions, restorative justice, and the long-term psychological effects of carrying violent secrets. Researchers hope the case might provide insights that could help identify perpetrators before they reach their deathbeds. We're studying whether there are behavioral patterns that might indicate someone is carrying the secret of a serious crime. If we can identify these patterns, we might be able to intervene earlier, either to encourage confession or to provide support that prevents future violence. The Anderson case has informed our understanding of perpetrator trauma and the potential for therapeutic intervention. We're developing treatment approaches for people who've committed serious crimes but retain normal moral functioning and experience severe guilt. Sarah Lindsay Martinez has become a sought-after speaker at schools and community events, sharing her father's story as part of violence prevention programs. Her message focuses on the ripple effects of violence and the power of choosing non-violent solutions to conflicts. When someone chooses violence, they don't just hurt their immediate victim. They hurt families, communities, and even themselves. Neil Anderson destroyed his own life the moment he decided to pull that trigger. Violence never creates more of what you want. It only creates more pain. Forgiveness isn't a feeling, it's a choice. I choose not to carry hatred because hatred would poison my life and hurt my children. Neil Anderson already took my father from me. I won't let him take my peace too. For Robert Anderson and his family, the past year has been one of grief, healing, and attempts to make meaning from their painful discovery about Neil. They've established a scholarship fund in Stephen Lindsay's name, funded by the proceeds from selling Neil's belongings. We can't undo what Neil did, but we can honor Stephen's memory and try to prevent other families from experiencing what we've all been through. The scholarship goes to single parents pursuing education, people like Stephen was, trying to build a better life for their children. Receiving the Stephen Lindsay Memorial Scholarship means I can continue my nursing program without worrying about how to pay for books and supplies. Knowing that this opportunity came from such a tragedy makes me want to use my education to help other families heal from trauma. In August 2025, the Summit County Prosecutor's Office filed the final paperwork officially closing the Stephen Lindsay murder case. The file, now over 500 pages thick, was transferred to the county archives, where it will be preserved as part of the historical record. This case will be studied for years to come by law enforcement, by academics, by families dealing with similar situations. It represents both the challenges and the possibilities inherent in cold case investigations. Sometimes justice doesn't look the way we expect, but that doesn't make it less real. The Lindsay case file is one of the most complete records of a posthumous confession that we have. It includes not just the investigative materials, but the journals, the family interviews, and documentation of the community healing process. It's a unique historical document. Sarah Lindsay Martinez has begun a new family tradition, an annual photo to mark her father's birthday, showing how his grandchildren are growing and changing. She plans to create a photo album for them, documenting their lives alongside stories of the grandfather they never met. My dad missed so much: my wedding, his grandchildren being born, all the everyday moments that make up a life. But in a strange way, getting answers about his death has made his memory more alive for us. We can talk about him now without the questions overshadowing everything else. April 20th, 2026. 2 years after learning the truth about her father's murder, Sarah organized a second memorial service. This one focused not on the crime or its resolution, but on Stephen Lindsay's life and the positive legacy his family was building in his memory. My father believed that people were fundamentally good, that everyone deserved compassion and second chances. I think he'd be proud that his death has led to conversations about healing rather than just punishment, that his grandchildren are learning to choose hope over hatred. The Memorial Garden in Copley has become a gathering place for families dealing with loss, violence, and the long journey toward healing. Visitors often leave flowers, notes, and small tokens of remembrance. The garden represents something new, a space that acknowledges the complexity of justice and the possibility of healing, even when traditional accountability is impossible. People ask me if I feel like we really solved the Stephen Lindsay case. I tell them we did more than solve it. We helped a family heal, we brought truth to light, and we demonstrated that justice doesn't always require a courtroom. Sometimes the most profound justice happens in the human heart. The Stephen Lindsay murder case officially closed on August 15, 2025, but its impact continues to ripple through the community and beyond. The case has changed how law enforcement approaches posthumous confessions, how victim advocates support families, and how communities think about justice and healing. My children will grow up knowing that their grandfather died because someone made a terrible choice in a moment of anger. But they'll also know that truth has power, that healing is possible, and that love is stronger than hatred. If that's his legacy, then something beautiful came from something terrible. 23 years after a young father was killed in a motel parking lot, his death has become more than a tragedy. It has become a testament to the power of truth, the possibility of forgiveness, and the complex nature of justice itself. The questions raised by the case continue to challenge our assumptions about crime, punishment, and redemption. The Stephen Lindsay case reminds us that justice is not always swift, punishment is not always possible, and healing is not always simple. But it also demonstrates that truth has its own power, conscience can overcome fear, and even the most tragic circumstances can become catalysts for compassion and understanding. In the end, the Copley murder mystery was solved not by forensic science or investigative brilliance, but by the weight of guilt carried too long and the courage of two families to choose healing over hatred. Their story continues to inspire others dealing with loss, seeking truth, and working toward a more just and compassionate world. The investigation may be closed, but the conversation it began continues. In communities across the country, families of victims and perpetrators are finding new ways to seek justice, pursue healing, and honor the memory of those lost to violence. The echo of Stephen Lindsay's story reminds us that even in our darkest moments, hope and redemption remain possible. The Copley case has fundamentally changed how federal law enforcement approaches posthumous confessions and family-mediated revelations. What happened in Summit County, Ohio, is now being studied by agencies nationwide as a model for handling complex cold case resolutions. The question we're grappling with is this: how do we create systems that encourage the kind of conscience-driven confession that solved the Lindsay case, while maintaining investigative integrity and supporting all affected families? September 2026, 18 months after the Stephen Lindsay murder case was officially closed, its impact has spread far beyond Summit County, Ohio, from FBI training academies to university ethics programs, from victim advocacy organizations to restorative justice initiatives. The case has become a touchstone for reimagining how society deals with crime, confession, and healing. The annual International Conference on Cold Case Investigations devoted an entire day to examining the Copley case, bringing together investigators, prosecutors, victim advocates, and family members from around the world to discuss what the case reveals about the evolving nature of justice in the 21st century. The Lindsay case represents a paradigm shift in how we think about case resolution. It challenges the binary thinking that says a case is either solved through arrest and prosecution or it remains unsolved. This case created a third category: moral resolution without legal consequence. In Spain, we've had 3 cases in the past year where family members came forward with information about deceased relatives after hearing about the Copley case. The publicity around this case seems to have given people permission to break family secrets that had been kept for decades. The psychological profile of Neil Anderson, the guilty perpetrator living in self-imposed isolation, has helped us identify potential suspects in several of our own cold cases. We're now looking more carefully at individuals who exhibit patterns of compulsive good behavior following periods of unaccounted time. Academic institutions have incorporated the Copley case into curricula ranging from criminal justice to moral philosophy. At the University of Chicago Law School, Professor Elena Vasquez has built an entire semester-long course around the ethical questions raised by the case. The traditional model of justice assumes that accountability requires the possibility of punishment. The Copley case forces us to ask what happens when punishment is impossible, but accountability is still necessary. Can society achieve justice through acknowledgement alone? But doesn't accepting posthumous confession as sufficient justice create a perverse incentive? Couldn't perpetrators deliberately wait until they're dying to confess, knowing they'll escape legal consequences? That's exactly the kind of complex question this case raises. We're forced to balance the value of truth and closure for victims, families against the moral hazard of appearing to reward delayed confession. The revelation of Neil Anderson's journals has sparked groundbreaking research into what psychologists now term moral injury. Self-infliction, the phenomenon of perpetrators essentially imprisoning themselves psychologically as a form of self-punishment. Anderson's case represents the most thoroughly documented example we have of long-term perpetrator trauma. His journals provide an unprecedented window into the mind of someone who committed impulsive violence and then spent decades trying to atone for it through behavioral modification. We're using neuroimaging to study individuals who report carrying long-term guilt about past actions. What we're finding is that chronic guilt literally rewires the brain, creating patterns of hypervigilance and compulsive moral behavior that mirror what we saw in Anderson's journals. The success of the collaborative approach between the Lindsay and Anderson families has led to the establishment of new victim advocacy programs specifically designed to support families dealing with posthumous confessions and other non-traditional case resolutions. We've had inquiries from families in 17 states who are dealing with similar situations, cases where the perpetrator died before prosecution, or where family members revealed information years after the fact. The Copley model has given these families a framework for processing complex emotions around delayed justice. Learning that my son's killer had been dead for 5 years when we finally identified him was devastating. But seeing how the Lindsay family handled their situation gave us hope that we could find peace even without a trial. The hardest part was feeling like we'd been cheated out of justice. But this group has helped me understand that justice isn't just about punishment, it's about truth, acknowledgement, and finding a way forward. The story of the Copley case has inspired numerous media adaptations, from true crime podcasts to fictional television series. But perhaps more significantly, it has influenced how journalists and filmmakers approach stories about crime and justice, encouraging more nuanced portrayals that acknowledge the complexity of real-world situations. The Copley case taught us that not every true crime story needs to end with handcuffs and a courtroom. Some of the most powerful stories are about how people find meaning and healing in the absence of traditional justice. That's changed how I approach every project now. We're seeing viewer appetite shift towards stories that explore the aftermath of crime, not just the crime itself. Audiences want to understand how communities heal, how families rebuild, how society processes complex moral questions. The Copley case represents that evolution perfectly. Sarah Lindsay Martinez has become a nationally recognized speaker on violence prevention, forgiveness, and restorative justice. Her presentations now reach thousands of people annually, from high school students to law enforcement professionals to religious congregations. When I started telling my father's story, I thought I was just sharing our family's experience. But I've learned that our story resonates with people dealing with all kinds of loss and injustice. The themes of patience, forgiveness, and finding peace in imperfect circumstances seem to be universal. How do you respond to critics who say that accepting your father's killer's posthumous confession lets him off too easily? I understand that perspective, but I've learned that justice isn't about satisfying our desire for revenge. Neil Anderson lived in a prison of guilt for 21 years. That's not getting off easy. That's a different kind of consequence, one that he imposed on himself every single day. Correctional facilities across the country have begun incorporating elements of the Copley case into their restorative justice programs, using Neil Anderson's story to help current inmates understand the long-term psychological consequences of violent crime. When we share Anderson's story with inmates, it often breaks through their psychological defenses in ways that traditional counseling approaches can't. Seeing how guilt destroyed someone's life for decades makes them confront the real cost of their actions, not just to their victims, but to themselves. Reading about Neil Anderson's journals was like looking in a mirror. I've been carrying guilt about what I did for 8 years, and it's eating me alive. His story made me realize that I need to find a way to make amends. Even from here, law enforcement agencies have begun implementing Copley protocols, systematic approaches for handling family-mediated confessions and encouraging conscience-driven revelations in cold cases. We've created a confidential hotline specifically for family members who might have information about deceased relatives' involvement in unsolved crimes. The Copley case showed us that guilt is hereditary. It passes down through families until someone finally has the courage to speak up. When family members call about posthumous confessions, they're dealing with a unique form of trauma: betrayal by a loved one's hidden actions, guilt about keeping secrets, and uncertainty about whether coming forward is the right thing to do. The Copley case gives us a roadmap for supporting these callers. Robert Anderson has returned to a more private life, but continues to receive calls from families facing similar situations. He's become an informal counselor for people struggling with the decision to reveal family secrets related to serious crimes. I probably get 2 or 3 calls a month from people who suspect a family member might have been involved in a crime, or who have information they're afraid to share. I tell them what I learned. Keeping the secret doesn't protect anyone, it just prolongs the pain for everyone involved. My father told me something before he died that I think the police need to know, but I'm scared of what it will do to our family's reputation, to my kids' understanding of their grandfather. I understand that fear completely. But I can tell you that the guilt of keeping that secret will be worse than the pain of revealing it. And somewhere out there is a family that needs the truth you're carrying. The Memorial Garden in Copley has been expanded to include an educational center that hosts workshops on conflict resolution, restorative justice, and community healing. The center receives visitors from around the world who come to study the Copley model of community response to complex justice situations. We've had delegations from Japan, Germany, South Africa, and Brazil come to study how our community processed the Lindsay case. They're interested in how we created space for both victim and perpetrator families to heal together. In our culture, family honor is extremely important. The idea that a family would voluntarily reveal a member's criminal actions to help another family heal, this challenges many of our assumptions about family loyalty and social responsibility. Technology companies have begun developing new tools inspired by the Copley case, including sophisticated psychological profiling software designed to identify individuals who might be carrying long-term guilt about serious crimes. We're using machine learning to analyze patterns in social media, employment records, and other digital footprints that might indicate someone is living with significant guilt. The goal isn't surveillance, but rather identifying people who might benefit from intervention or counseling. The Anderson profile: social isolation, compulsive good behavior, avoidance of intimate relationships, career instability despite competence. These patterns can be identified algorithmically. The question is whether we can use this information ethically to solve cold cases. Medical schools have begun incorporating the Copley case into their ethics curricula, particularly in discussions about end-of-life care and the responsibility of healthcare providers when patients make spontaneous confessions. Neil Anderson confessed to his brother, not to medical staff, but what if he had confessed to a nurse or doctor? How do we balance patient confidentiality with the duty to provide closure to victims' families? These are questions we never had to consider before cases like this. If a dying patient confessed to murder, would we be legally required to report it? Ethically required? What if reporting it would violate their trust during their most vulnerable moment? 2 years after Neil Anderson's death, his former church held a memorial service that acknowledged both his crime and his decades of repentance. The service, attended by both Anderson family members and members of the Lindsay family, represented another step in the complex process of community healing. Neil Anderson's story reminds us that redemption is possible even for those who commit terrible acts, but that redemption doesn't erase consequences. He found a kind of peace through his confession, but he also lived with appropriate suffering for his actions. Having Sarah and her family at Neil's memorial service was incredibly meaningful. It showed that forgiveness doesn't require forgetting, and that healing can acknowledge the full complexity of human nature, our capacity for both great harm and great remorse. As we conclude our examination of the Copley murder mystery and its ongoing impact, the questions raised by the case continue to evolve. What started as a simple cold case investigation has become a catalyst for reimagining justice, accountability, and healing in the 21st century. When people ask me what I've learned from my father's case, I tell them that justice is bigger and more complex than any single definition. Sometimes justice is a courtroom verdict. Sometimes it's a deathbed confession. Sometimes it's the choice to forgive. Sometimes it's the courage to tell the truth, even when it's painful. The ripple effects of the Copley case continue to spread through academic institutions, law enforcement agencies, victim advocacy organizations, and communities around the world. What began as one family's 22-year search for answers has become a global, Conversation about the nature of justice itself. The Stephen Lindsay case taught me that sometimes the most important thing law enforcement can do is simply bear witness to the truth, even when that truth is complicated and doesn't fit our usual categories. Sometimes being a good cop means being a good human being first. The Memorial Garden in Copley has become more than a monument to Stephen Lindsay. It has become a symbol of community's capacity to process complex tragedies and find paths toward healing that honor both victims and the complexity of human nature. 2.5 years after a dying man's confession solved a decades-old murder, the case continues to challenge our assumptions about crime, punishment, and redemption. It reminds us that justice is not always swift, accountability is not always simple, and healing often requires the courage to embrace complexity rather than seeking easy answers. The Stephen Lindsay murder case will continue to influence how society deals with crime and its aftermath for years to come. Its greatest lesson may be that truth has its own power, that acknowledgement, apology, and the courage to face difficult realities can sometimes accomplish what courts and prisons cannot. In the end, the Copley murder mystery was about more than solving a cold case. It was about communities learning to hold space for complexity, families finding the courage to forgive the unforgivable, and society discovering that justice can take forms we never imagined. The conversation it began continues in classrooms, courtrooms, and communities around the world. Stephen Lindsay's death created ripples that spread far beyond a motel parking lot in Ohio. 23 years later, those ripples continue to reach new shores, carrying with them lessons about truth, forgiveness, and the endless human capacity for both destruction and redemption. The mystery may be solved, but the questions it raised will resonate for generations to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.